If not now, when? I realized at that time that if I didn't do it, I would probably end up regretting it. I don't want to be in my deathbed asking myself, like, what if I had done it? What if I had tried? And what really helped me was saying, let me give myself 6 months, go to San Francisco, see if I can make something happen. If it doesn't work out, it's okay.
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Hey friends, great to be here with you. I'm your host, Simon Hill. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. In keeping with the recent theme exploring alternative proteins, everything from plant-based proteins to precision fermentation and cultivated meat, today I sit down with Arturo Gonzalez from the EveryCo, formerly Clara Foods, a company based in Silicon Valley that specializes in using precision fermentation to produce animal-free protein, their first commercial product being egg white. Arturo has a fascinating backstory, one that includes an abrupt change in career and a huge leap of faith, a leap that so far seems to be paying off in dividends. The EveryCo raised $175 million in December 2021, funds that will be used to allow them to rapidly scale and expand across America, an important step towards fulfilling the company's mission to change the paradigm and help the world shift to an animal-free food system. I really enjoyed this conversation. Subject matter aside, if you're stuck at a crossroads and looking to follow your dreams, I think you'll be inspired by Arturo's journey. This is Arturo Gonzalez, CEO and founder of the EveryCo. Please do enjoy, and I'll catch you on the other side. Hey Arturo, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Simon. Great to be here.
Yes, I've really been looking forward to this. We must have caught up about a month ago or so, right? When we had a previous conversation. So nice to be chatting again. Kick things off for me here. You know, CEO of a fast-growing food tech startup in Silicon Valley. I'd love to kind of get a feel for what a typical day in the life of Arturo Elizondo is. Do you have a kind of set routine most days in and amongst what I can only assume by that whiteboard behind you for those watching is fairly chaotic and forever changing? It would be quite a fast-paced environment, I'm sure. I'd love to know what a typical day looks like and what works best for you.
Yeah, happy to share. My schedule and what I focus on changes every day, but has changed a lot since the early days of formerly Clara Foods, which we founded almost 8 years ago. We're one of the oldest companies in the alt protein space, and now we're in the process of scaling. And so my days look very differently now that we have a lot more people and a much bigger team to take on and put out more fires than I was able to back then. But in terms of the day to day, I like to start off by journaling. I think a big part of my growth last several years has been on bringing intentionality back into my life and transitioning away from pure, firefighting, reactive state to more intentional way of working. And it's a constant battle, but I realize that going slow to go fast.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very, very helpful. And so I do that in the mornings, and then Uber to work. It's like a 12-minute ride, and I kind of use that as time to meditate for a few minutes, but also start getting some emails going. And that way, when I come into the office, I hit the ground running. And now I spend my time more so on kind of 1 foot in the company and then 1 foot out. 1 foot in the company, working with my COO, my VP of strategy, and my chief of staff on like the day-to-day part of the business, and then 1 foot out, working with our investors, our board, and partners, big, new things that we're looking to incorporate into the business. And so that's how I spend my time for the most part.
Silicon Valley, I think most people are familiar with it, or at least have heard about it. But I'd love to hear from you as a kind of insider in 2022. Give me a taste for Silicon Valley. What is, as a community, what is it all about? What are the things that you love? Perhaps things that you maybe don't love that much.
Yeah, well, I was a huge outsider before coming in 8 years ago. I'm from Texas originally. Grew up in Mexico. Spent some years in Mexico when I was growing up, and then spent most of my time on the East Coast in Boston and then DC. So until Silicon Valley, I didn't really know anything about this world. But what I've come to appreciate, because investors or people that I would meet would ask me, well, why are you all based here, and what's the magic? Why are all of these companies in Silicon Valley? And what I would say is, this is probably one of the only places in the world where people are crazy, where crazy people are willing to fund crazy ideas. And, there's a lot of money and, in many places across the world. But what makes, I think, this place special is that the people who have money here made their money with crazy ideas. Right, you have you have early employees have like Facebook and Google and Apple and Dropbox and Uber and those the early employees, all of them become millionaires, and then what do they invest in? They invest in other crazy ideas because that's how they made their money. And so there's this sort of really strong community and critical mass of angels, of super angels, of investors that are willing to fund it at the very early stages when companies are at where they have the highest risk profile, and no one really is willing to fund them. And so that's what I think makes this place really, really interesting.
Yeah. So that sort of crazy idea or ambition that you may be talked out of in another location around the world, it sounds like what you're saying is those crazy ideas are actually quite normal in that environment.
Yeah, exactly. And it also doesn't hurt that it's in California and people already have these, they're kind of on a different wavelength, and Burning Man is close by, and you have people from totally different backgrounds just interacting with each other that I think also makes it especially an especially fertile ground for crazy ideas to emerge.
Is there a lot of kind of collaboration, cross-pollination between companies with leaders, perhaps between categories, or is it quite a fierce competitive environment?
I think I can't speak for all kinds of across industries, but I do know that particularly on the in the world that I've been in, both on the food side and the biotech side, it's quite friendly. And I think part of it is a lot of us as founders are very mission driven. Many of us are missionaries and not mercenaries. And you have a lot of founders maybe in Silicon Valley that it's like their fifth company, and they're it's not their first time, their first rodeo, and maybe they're more on the mercenary route. But I would say the vast majority of founders that I have met are very, very mission driven. And I think that coming from that background and from that perspective, I've found to have it be a very, just a very amicable and uncompetitive place. And I think when I talk to other founders, we're all going up against, the competition is not each other. It's industrialized animal agriculture, which is where we get over 90% of all the meat, dairy, and eggs that we consume as a world.
Yeah, I want to come to that industry piece and dig into that competition and what that's like at some point in this conversation. So you said in 2015 you founded Clara Foods. Or I believe it maybe it had another name at that stage. Was that right?
Yeah, it was called the very, very first name was a New Harvest Egg Project, and then like 2 months later, we called it
Mm-hmm.
Clara Foods.
Okay. And so now this is evolved and is known as the Every Company. And it is a really fascinating journey. I've heard you speak a number of times, and I'm super excited to kind of unpack it all. I was reading one of your press releases following the funds that you raised in December, which was quite a lot of money. And there was a quote from one of your investors, Rage Capital, and
Yeah.
I took a note of that. They said that by leveraging precision fermentation technologies, Every is bringing ingredient synthesis from science fiction to supermarket aisles, starting with egg proteins and enzymes. And I thought this was a really interesting quote because whenever I cover this topic or speak about it with someone that's new, it does seem like science fiction when you first hear about the things that you're doing. But from what I understand, and I want you to get you to comment on this, it's not really so much a question of if you're already doing some of this right now. And from my understanding, you're well on the way to helping sort of redefine the way that we're thinking about producing animal protein. Would you say that that's a fair summary?
Yeah, 100%. And I'll add, one of our investors, had a quote that said, the future is already here. The problem is that it's not evenly distributed. And that's, I think, what gets to what you're saying is like for so many people, in many parts of the world, this sounds crazy and almost impossible. And we've already launched 3 products. We've been selling our products the last 2 years, and we just launched the world's first egg white without a chicken 2 months ago. And so people are already eating our products. This is already real. But it's true. I think for most, it still feels very much like science fiction.
So we'll come to those products because I have a number of questions about the way that you're actually producing them and how you're able to produce animal protein without an animal. It's kind of a abstract thing to think about, but the process is very neat, and I think you're very good at explaining how it works. Let's wind the clock back a little bit though here. And you mentioned Texas, and I wore my Texas hat today as a bit of a nod to
Love
you.
it.
I too actually spent about 3.5, 4 years living in Texas when I was a young kid. So we share that history there. Tell me about life as a kid for you, and what I'm really interested in is your kind of relationship with food as a kid, and whether yourself or as a family you ever remember as a child or a teenager kind of stopping and thinking about where our food comes from and the sort of effect that it has on the world around us.
Yeah. Well, you as a fellow Texan probably know it's the barbecue capital of the world, and animal protein was a huge part of my life, both as a as a Texan with Mexican heritage. Like any good Texan, I had my barbecues every Sunday, and like any good Mexican, I had my 2 egg for breakfast every morning. And animal protein was a huge part of my life, and I never questioned where my food came from. Like that was I'd never met a vegetarian up until I went to college. Like that was. It was like something that I knew existed, but it felt so far away and so distant from my reality. And it wasn't until I was 16 and I was online on social media, and someone posted a video of a factory farm, like an undercover investigation, and there was this like guy working at a at a chicken farm, and he grabbed two chickens by the neck and just slammed them across, onto the cage. And I was shocked. Like, I was sick to my stomach, and I thought, this is an atrocity. There's no way that this is where our food comes from. Like, this is a crime, and there are laws in place to protect these animals. And so I posted on Facebook and or I don't know what the social media, maybe it was MySpace. But I was so just upset, and it clicked for me, like, oh, I'm eating animals, and they come from factory farms. And that's when I told my mom, like, you know what, I don't want to eat this anymore. She's like, good luck. I have 5 other kids to feed. I'm one of 6 kids. And she said, go make, you can make your own meals, but I'm not gonna cook anything differently for you. And I lasted a whopping 2 weeks as a vegetarian, until I left for college. But that was the first time that I really thought critically about where my food came from. And in some ways, since then, I almost tried to turn my brain off when I was eating, because I didn't want to think about it anymore, because it felt like this very strong cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about heading off to college. You mentioned that there. I think many may presume that you went straight into studying something about food or food tech, or some sort of science around fermentation, but that's not, from my understanding, the direction that you initially took. And if I have done my research well, I believe that you even ended up doing an internship at the Supreme Court and at the White House. No small feat, either of those, but you had headed off in this kind of very different direction to where you are now. Tell us about that journey.
Yeah. I never thought I would be a founder. I never thought I would work in food like those. I never thought I would be running a biotech company. And I never thought that I'd end up in Silicon Valley. Like, that was never part of the equation, because that was a world I didn't know. And I knew from an early age, I grew up on the border between Texas and Mexico in a city called Laredo. And my dad worked in Mexico, and he would commute every single day to go to work. And on the weekends, I would go to work with him and cross the border, and I would see little kids my age. I was 6 or 7, and I would see little kids my age who had no shoes, who were selling gum on the streets. And I thought, man, like, that could be me. Like, there was, had I been born a few miles south of the border, or had I been, born to different parents in a different family, my life would have been completely different. And so I knew early on that I wanted to dedicate my life to service, and in my head that meant public service, because that's the only way I knew. I thought that I could make a positive impact in the world. It was through government. Because if I could change one law in one small way, I could really make a big difference and impact the lives of millions of people or creatures, beings. Went to Harvard, went to study government, and I'm going to become an ambassador to the UN and, help the world that way. I was an idealist, and in many ways I still am. And I tried to figure out, how could I make a difference in government? And so I interned with my congressman in Texas, in the Department of Agriculture, at the White House under President Obama, and then at the Supreme Court. And I even spent some time at the UN, and just trying to see if I could fit somewhere where I could feel like I was really making a difference. And the more I tried, the more I realized that I'm far too impatient for the political process.
And so at what point was it that you began to think about this idea of producing animal protein without an animal? I've read some stories that suggest you were in Geneva and you were researching China and their growing meat consumption. Is that the initial sort of
Yeah.
project that sort of opened your
Yeah.
eyes to this new and evolving industry?
Yeah, you definitely did your research. That's exactly right. I was in Geneva. I was studying global food security at the UN, and I I read a headline that said China, an article that came out that month, as I was researching in 2012. This was exactly 10 years ago, and the headline was China doubles its own meat consumption in less than 20 years, and it now consumes more than double the amount of meat of the U.S. And I had been at the USDA when we were slaughtering over 1 million animals per hour in the US alone to feed less than 5% of the world population. And so then seeing that China now consumed more than double the amount of meat of the US, and there were no signs of it slowing down, and it's not just China, but across the developing countries, the first thing people do when they enter the middle class is that they buy animal protein. There's almost a one-to-one correlation between GDP per capita and animal protein consumption. And so I did the math. I was like, there's just not enough land or water on the planet to satiate that kind of appetite for animal protein. And something's got to give. And then I began researching the impact, like what that meant. And today, even before, having this, even before having these insane increases in animal protein consumption, which are still predicted to increase well into 2050, today, animal agriculture, the meat that people eat today, and eggs and dairy, emits more greenhouse gases than the entire transportation sector, than all the cars, planes, ships, boats, motorcycles in the world combined. It is the number one cause of deforestation on Earth, because so much of the Amazon rainforest is not being cut down it's being cut down to grow soy, but it's not soy to make tofu to feed to people. The soy is going to feed livestock. And there's an insane conversion ratio where you have to grow all these grains and soy to feed these animals, to convert plant protein into animal protein. And there's a huge loss of efficiency right then and there, making animal agriculture the number one cause of extinction on Earth. And it uses 3/4 of the world's agricultural land. 75% of the land used for agriculture today is dedicated to growing animals. And so the list just kept on and on and on. It takes over 600 gallons of water to make a dozen eggs, or over 2,400 liters of water. And so, the more I researched this and the more that I learned about the impact of animal ag, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I became obsessed trying to figure out, are there ways that we could have a more efficient and sustainable technology that doesn't kill us or the planet in the process?
And so you come across this emerging field of innovation, food tech, called cultivated meat. I'm not sure what it was called at that stage, because it has had quite a few different name changes, which potentially you can speak to. But I'm interested, when you first started reading about it, were you skeptical? Because I think a lot of people automatically will go to skepticism as soon as they hear about it. Tell me when you first started reading about it, what introduced you to this concept, and how did you feel about it?
Totally. So the first thing I did when I learned about the massive problems in food, I was like, why is no one talking about this? And I was like, and my mind immediately, and this is just how I'm wired, like as soon as I hear a problem, even when a friend is sharing, I'm not the best friend when it comes to certain situations, because as soon as a friend or a family member tells me about a problem, my mind immediately goes, so, well, what about this? And what if you tried this? Or what if you did this? And I immediately go into problem solving mode. And so as soon as I learned the problems of animal ag, I began immediately just researching, like, what technologies are out there to solve this problem. And so I went down this massive rabbit hole where I began researching the different technologies, and I came across the two big areas of alternative protein technologies. One is plants, and two is cells, like cell-based technology. And so on the plant side, that's more of the Beyond Meat, the veggie burgers, the Impossible Foods, the plant, using plants like pea and soy and texture, using new texturizing technologies to get them to have a similar mouthfeel and a similar bite to the animal products. And so that way you can get plant proteins to start resembling more and more the animal products that they're aiming to replace. So kind of a higher tech version of, your grandma's veggie burger, that you could see the carrots and the peas on there. Now, with new technologies, you can improve the texture to get them to be actually quite compelling, but still using plants. And then the cell-based technology, which at that point was, was just called like lab-grown meat or cultured meat. Now we have cultivated meat is a new term, where you grow, you get a couple cells from an animal, right? And meat is basically just a bunch of cells together, and you get those cells. You get a couple cells from an animal, like in this case, a cow, and you would give them nutrients to grow, and the cells replicate. And so you're working with the same exact building blocks of meat, and recreating and just replicating them to the point where you end up with like tissue that then you can cook and grill. And I mean, and at that point, I think Mark Post had made the first burger, and it was like $300,000. But I was like, man, like this is amazing. And I was maybe a little skeptical about the cost for sure, but the technology. I mean, seeing the burger in in pictures and that this is real, made it very real to me.
Was Memphis Meats, now Upside Foods, were they around then?
No, we were before them. So I think before us, the only companies they came after us through the same program called IndieBio. So we're the first company to ever get funded out of IndieBio, and it's here in San Francisco. And then since there, there was Memphis Meats, now Upside, Finless Foods that makes seafood, cell-based seafood, New Wave that makes shrimp with algae. So now there's a lot more companies. I think there's now, we're number 5. I think it's probably now like over 300 companies in the space.
So at that stage, you're in Geneva. You learn about the problems in China. You're compelled to start researching and think about, well, here's a problem. What solutions exist? You come across cultivated meat. At that stage, had you become aware of microbial fermentation, which I understand you use and is, I guess, slightly different to kind of the cellular agriculture that you just described?
Yeah, so it's funny because my journey took me to, all right, like my thesis was, my big takeaway from that research was both of these technologies are very interesting, using plants and using cells, but they're on opposite sides of the spectrum, right? With plants, the scalability component is absolutely there, right? You're using off-the-shelf technology that already exists. You're using ingredients like pea and soy that companies have been using for decades. But, the fungibility is an open question, right? Getting the plant proteins to taste and function like the animal proteins is still something that's being worked on. And then for cell-based, it was a complete opposite, where the fungibility, right, the taste of the products, I mean, you're working with the same exact building blocks. And so you can get to a much more compelling, sensory profile. But the challenge becomes the scalability. And that's something that now there are a lot of companies working around. But at the time, it was incredibly cost prohibitive. I mean, $300,000 for a burger, right? That's quite steep. And so, but what the big takeaway for me was, there is something here, and specifically, my hypothesis became technology can be used. There are technologies out there that we could use to give industrial animal agriculture a run for its money and truly transform our food system. And that was my big takeaway. And it wasn't until I moved to San Francisco where I met my co-founder, who had this crazy idea of making eggs without using chickens. where we talked about the fermentation technology. And when I did the research, I thought, man, like that's the third kind of pillar of alternative proteins. Now it's plant-based on one side, cell-based on the other, and then fermentation kind of in the middle. And I fell in love with that technology because the scalability, I mean, companies across the world have scaled this technology for decades, and the fungibility was, I mean, it was incredible. You can make real animal proteins without using an animal with the same taste, nutrition, and functionality that made it very, very compelling as a technology.
Mm-hmm. Let's back up a tiny bit. You just mentioned that you flew to San Francisco, and you said that rather nonchalantly, like it was a quick and easy decision. And I'm interested. You know, your move to San Francisco from the outside. You know, you were in this other career path.
Totally.
And you were kind of on your way up to working in government and thinking about policy, trying to influence the world in that way, make the world more equitable. But then you decide, or you feel compelled, drawn to explore this area of food tech. The decision to leave behind what you were doing, pack up and go to San Francisco, what was the kind of game plan that you had in mind when you did that? Did you already understand what you would be doing in San Francisco, or was it more pack up, get on a plane, let's get over to Silicon Valley and see what happens?
Yeah, it was much more the latter. I had no job. I had no place to stay. But I knew I had to give myself a shot at trying to make something happen. So I was actually in DC at that time, and I was about to take a job in the Obama administration full time. And I called up my amazing mentor of mine who was, I did an internship also at Credit Suisse, an investment bank. And he was also vegan and super excited about food tech. And so I would call him up and just fangirl about all these companies and technologies and how much I wanted to do it. And so I called him up and I was like, hey, I'm about to take a job in the Obama administration, because I never thought that I would work in food formally until maybe down the road in my career when I had skills to contribute. And maybe I was, maybe it was more on the government side or something else. It didn't cross my mind that I would start something. But I remember calling him and I was so excited. I was like, I'm about to take a job in the Obama administration. This is exactly what I studied. This is exactly part of my 10-year plan for myself that I had since I was like 16. And instead of him being excited, he just asked me, what are you doing? Like, why? You should be in San Francisco. Like, why aren't you in San Francisco building the future of food and working on what you've been telling me since we met, which was your passion? And it caught me off guard because I wasn't expecting him to tell it to me that bluntly. But as soon as he did, I just stayed quiet and I was like, you know what? I breathed heavily and I was like, you're right. Like, what am I doing? And I realized that at that point that I was scared. Like not having a plan was something that was very foreign to me. And I was scared to fail. I was scared to do something that I had no idea was going to pan out. And I didn't want to do it, but there was something in my gut that said, if not now, when? And I thought that I would. I realized at that time that if I didn't do it, I would probably end up regretting it. And I thought I may be on my death. I don't want to be in my deathbed asking myself, like, what if I had done it? What if I had tried? And what really helped me was saying, let me give myself 6 months, go to San Francisco, see if I can make something happen. If it doesn't work out, it's okay. I'll reapply, go back in government or go do something else. And I think me giving myself permission to just try it and time bounding it was a very helpful way of thinking about it that made it much more of a manageable and managed risk that then I could take.
Mm-hmm. So I guess as well within the government career that you were pursuing, you'd kind of gone far enough to be able to have it still as a fallback plan if things didn't quite work out.
Well, I think it was also acknowledging like, no, I mean, that's what I was scared of. I was like, if I leave, I don't know if I'm going to get this job again or if there's going to be something else. But I think what I realize is I'm gonna work my ass off trying to make that happen. And I'm at least going to have a lot more conviction in pursuing this path in government if I know that the food piece fails. If I fail at that, I know that I can double down on government. And I think what I realize is if I did the government path, or if I pursued that, I knew I wasn't going to be the best. I knew I wasn't going to be the best because my heart wasn't going to be 100% in it. And so I almost had to get it out of my system, right? Get the food out of my system. And like, if I failed miserably, I could then go back into government with a focus and conviction to say, this is what I'm going to do. And, in a couple of years, then I can work my way back into food. And I think that was quite helpful. So the day after I had that call with my mentor, where I was like, you know what, you're right. It was a really, my stomach was hurting. I remember, and I didn't want to do it because I was scared. But the next day, I booked a one-way ticket to San Francisco, and I thought, you know what, let me just try it.
So you had the support of this friend of yours. Do you recall any conversations with your family or the rest of your kind of support network? Yeah. I mean, getting this opportunity in the Obama administration is kind of a big deal. So I'm sure there were other people that perhaps had an opinion. Was the kind of overwhelming response one of just supporting you in this, or were there others that perhaps thought you were mad?
Yeah, no. Yeah, my parents were by far the most. They were disappointed and upset. Like, they didn't really quite understand it, because government is also like safe, and it's exactly what I had been telling them I wanted to do, and they could at least imagine it in a way that, like, this whole San Francisco thing and food, like, even to this day, when I talk to my mom, she's like, how's your science project go? How's your project going? And it's like,
that's
for
cute.
her,
it's cute.
Like, she, it's so, for her, it feels like something that isn't, it's so different from the world that we grew up in Texas, that it's hard to wrap to wrap their heads around. There were, my siblings, they knew how much how much I cared about this. And I remember, just like rescuing like pigeons that would crash into our windows at our house, and me trying to rescue them when I was little. And so they knew how much I cared about this issue. And so I think overall they were quite supportive. But my parents, what I loved about them is at some point they were like, look, because they grew up in Mexico, they couldn't help me in the application process for college. They couldn't help me in school. And they, in some ways I kind of had to figure it out, or work with my siblings and friends to get advice on how to progress in my career and in school. So my parents were, they were pretty hands off and said, you know what, at the end of the day, like, you've kind of managed to do well on your own. Like, you have good judgment, this is your life, and, we don't agree with it, but, do whatever you want. And that was helpful.
So you sort of got the tick of approval there, and then you head to San Francisco. You mentioned that you met your business partners there, Isha and Dave, who then you went on to found Clara Foods with. For folks who have not heard of Isha before and her work with New Harvest, can you give them a bit of a sort of Isha 101? Because she does seem to be like a very important figure, a sort of pioneer of this space.
Absolutely. Yeah, she and so let me back up a little bit. I moved to San Francisco, and the first thing I did is start just networking my ass off, like trying to just emailing friends and contacts in food, like cold emailing VCs to see if I could maybe join a fund to help deploy capital. And one founder of a company called Hampton Creek, now called Just, they make the vegan eggs using plants, using mung beans. They, my friend Josh Falk, I had met him in Boston when I was there for school. I reached out to him and said, "Hey, I'm here in San Francisco. I want to join the movement. I just, I left everything to make something happen." He said, "All right, come to this conference with me in 2 weeks. It's one of the first ever Future of Food conferences, and hopefully you'll meet some interesting people there." I show up. That's the day that Hampton Creek got sued by Unilever for like mislabeling their mayonnaise because it didn't have eggs in it. And so he ends up not going. I show up to this conference by myself, and I see the only table with young people in it. And there was an empty chair, and something in me was like, I need to take that chair. And so I just walked up and asked if I could take that seat. And little did I know, I was sitting across the table from Dave, my future co-founder, and Isha from New Harvest, and then the founders of Perfect Day, formerly Mufri. And Isha is the executive director of New Harvest, which I had actually researched and interviewed the founder of New Harvest when I was in Geneva studying cell-based technology. And so I told her I'd watch her TED Talk, and New Harvest helps accelerate the entire sort of alternative protein ecosystem, but particularly on the cell-based kind of deep tech angle. And so she had brought David, my co-founder from Canada, who was finishing up his PhD in microbiology, to this conference as well because he wanted to do something. And he's the one who had the crazy idea without using chickens. She had already helped co-found Perfect Day and said, "You know what, you and Dave need to come together and apply to this firm called Indie Bio and start the, see if this idea has any legs."
So talk me through the idea. So I think you said Dave had this kind of idea of creating eggs without needing chickens. I'm interested in the kind of creation of that idea, or him wanting to kind of pursue that. Why eggs? Was that sort of a product of the kind of where the landscape was at and that there was no one focusing on eggs? And secondly to that, I'm interested in your reaction. So you meet Dave. He says he wants to do this with eggs. Can you remember how you sort of initially felt when you heard that?
Yeah, well, when he first told me, and it was like replicating the hand oviduct cell, so it was actually using the cell-based technology, I was like, this is going to be hard because if making meat is hard, maybe making eggs using that technology is like 10 times harder. And so I knew it was going to be really challenging. But as we talked about it and as he thought through it, that's when, he realized, there's fermentation as a technology, which Perfect Day was using for dairy. Impossible was using for their heme protein that kind of is the secret sauce to their burgers. And other companies have been using. That's when he was like, look, we actually could use the fermentation technology to make eggs because eggs actually don't have any cells. They're just proteins, fats, and water for the most part. And so from a technical feasibility standpoint, it made a ton of sense. And then when I started looking at the research and the business side, it's like eggs were actually super expensive. And egg whites specifically, which were much simpler as a product, were even more expensive because Subway had just launched the egg white, breakfast, the egg white delight for their breakfast. McDonald's had launched the egg white, the egg white McMuffin, and almost every restaurant was launching a healthier breakfast options. And so eggs had gone through the roof from a pricing standpoint. And so I was like, look, the business is there. The B2B angle I thought was really compelling because eggs are not just a tasty
Mm-hmm.
product, but they're a critical ingredient in so many things. Like they're in cakes and patties and and protein bars. I mean, they're in face masks, like, and all of these companies, I couldn't imagine them wanting to be using eggs, except for the fact that they just do things that nothing else can do, and so they're very hard to replace. And so I found that the B2B angle was very compelling because it aligned very much with the way that I saw the world, which was, I don't want to convince people to buy our products. I want to make it just so easy that
Mm-hmm.
they're buying already. Like my mom and dad, I've been vegan for 10 years. They still eat steak as often as they get there, as often as they can.
Mm-hmm.
And they know how much this means to me. And so if my parents and my siblings are still eating the way that we ate growing up, I'm realizing consumer habits and changing them is incredibly difficult. But my mom buys the same cake, for Christmas every year, the same, more or less the same grocery list. And so we could work with the brands that she already buys and that consumers already buy, and just, revamp the back end of food production without
Mm-hmm.
compromising the consumer experience. I thought that's how we can make a massive, massive difference in our food system. If we work in the back end and work with all the world's biggest companies and then scale much, much faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And for folks that maybe are hearing B2B for the first time, that means essentially creating these ingredients, products, and selling them to other businesses, which are then using them in their formulations, food products, as opposed to a B2C customer that would be selling direct to consumer as a brand that you may see on the shelf. I'm curious. So the technology, as I understand it, to produce egg protein through fermentation, that at least some of that technology has existed for quite a long time, 40 plus years. And you can kind of speak to the history of that. But I'm interested, why do you think nobody else had thought about using it to produce egg protein?
Yeah. It's a great question, and one that I was asked almost, every day when I was pitching the company to investors, which is, so one is, yes, the technology has been around for 40 years. And that was shocking to me as well. I'm like, why would we not why, if this technology works and has been scaled before, why aren't we using this for other applications? And what I realized is that combining disciplines is actually quite hard and not intuitive and quite different. And what I mean by that is, this technology had largely lived in pharma companies. Like, the technology had been around for 40 years, but actually having people take a technology from one industry and apply it to another doesn't happen very often. Sometimes technologies just live in certain industries for decades. And so, Genentech across the street from us, actually here in our labs, was the first ever biotech company in the world. They helped make the first ever animal protein without using an animal. And that protein is insulin. Insulin came from pigs. Before the 80s, we had to kill a pig to get the insulin protein. You have to kill the pig, extract the insulin protein from their pancreas, purify it, and then inject it into people. And that's how every diabetic got their insulin protein from. Otherwise, they would die. And it wasn't kosher, it wasn't halal, it wasn't vegan. But if you wanted to live as a diabetic, you had to get your insulin protein.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the only way to do it. Genentech found a way to essentially 3D print that DNA sequence encoded in that codes for the insulin protein. So all proteins in the world are encoded by 4 letters, right? A, T, C, and G. In the same way that all computers are encoded by zeros and ones.
Mm-hmm.
So those 4 letters code for every protein in the world, and depending on how they're arranged, code for specific kinds of proteins. And Genentech found a way to 3D print that DNA encode that into a microbe, and then ferment it, and then have it print out that specific protein. So fast forward to today, 99% of insulin is no longer made by pigs, but by fermenters. And so we thought, this is a very cool technology. Can we actually use the same technology, and instead of making pig proteins, and now pharma companies all over the world use this technology to make other kinds of medicines, other kinds of drugs. So this technology has been, a lot of the medicines that we consume today and that we inject into our blood today are made using the exact same technology, but it hadn't really been used in food in a significant way because it was pretty cost prohibitive. Insulin is very expensive, and just as a fun fact, you needed to kill over 50,000 pigs to make 1 kilo of insulin protein before fermentation.
Hey friends, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. A quick message from one of our sponsors who makes this show possible, and then we'll jump straight back into things. If you're familiar with my nutrition philosophy, you will know that I'm a huge believer in plant-rich diets being better for people and our planet. You'll also know that I frequently draw attention to what I describe as nutrients of focus. These are nutrients that science shows plant-based eaters, whether plant predominant or exclusive, can fall short in, which can leave you feeling run down, lacking energy, experiencing brain fog, and generally just not as vital as you'd like to be. For that reason, together with Emil, a plant-based health and wellness company, I formulated Essential 8. Essential 8 is your one-stop multi-nutrient, formulated with DHA, EPA, omega-3s from algae oil, vitamin B12, iodine, vitamin D3, iron, zinc, selenium, and calcium to perfectly complement your plant-rich diet. I personally take Essential 8 every morning with breakfast, just 2 capsules, much easier than supplementing with these 8 key nutrients individually. What's even more convenient is I have a monthly subscription, so it turns up automatically on my doorstep and I never miss a beat. To get yours, head to theproof.com/friends. That's theproof.com/friends, where you'll find a link to purchase Essential 8 that will get you an extra 5% off your first order on top of the significant subscription discount. There will also be a link to this in the show notes. Okay, back to the show. So if I'm kind of hearing you correctly, of course, being able to produce meat and complete eggs and whatnot is important. And hopefully we get to a future where that's happening through cellular agriculture and precision fermentation. But it sounds like there's a whole lot of other proteins, animal-derived proteins in our food system that perhaps people are not aware of. They're not as tangible.
Yeah.
And that, companies like yours and some of the ingredients that you're producing to begin with, or the proteins, can actually make a huge difference simply by being an ingredient within existing products.
Exactly. And what was the craziest part is that it's not just that it lived in pharma, it was actually already in food when we started the company. So 10 years later, the dairy industry took note of this technology and started making a protein called rennet using this technology. Mm-hmm. And for context, rennet is a protein that is used to curdle the milk to make cheese. And the only way to make cheese industrially was to get the rennet from baby cows that were only a couple of days old. And the rennet could only be found in the 4th stomach of baby cows. So you have to kill the baby cow, extract the rennet protein from their 4th stomach, throw that into milk, and have it curdle to make cheese. And at the time, that was so cheese wasn't vegetarian up until the 90s. The only way to, at scale, the only way to produce cheese was by killing baby cows. And now fast forward to today, after some of these companies started making the rennet protein using fermentation, around 90% of the cheese in the US and around over 80% of the cheese produced in the world is made using fermentation. And so we thought, look, we've replaced the pig for insulin protein production as a society. We replaced the baby cow for rennet protein production, we thought, can we replace the chicken for egg protein production? And can we replace animals more broadly from the protein production process? And that's really the innovation that we're creating here, is democratizing that technology and applying that across the board.
It's great to have those examples because I think it does make it less science fiction-y when you can explain that we're already using this on scale in other areas. I've had a guy called Jared Rains on the show previously. He's from a company in Australia called All G Foods that are interested in using precision fermentation to produce dairy products, mostly milk they're looking at. So we did talk a little bit about the sort of process of using microbes and the DNA sequencing that's involved, but it is a bit of a sort of complex area for someone that's hearing this for the first time. So perhaps we just tread through that in a little bit more detail. Can you kind of explain that process? What is a 3D printed DNA sequence? Sort of where do you get that from? And when you say you encode a microbe or put that into a microbe, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, happy to. I'll take a step back, and I think the easiest way for me to understand it was microbes are like little factories. And so in the same way that brewers use yeast to convert sugar into alcohol to make beer and wine, bakers use yeast to convert sugar into carbon dioxide to leaven bread. And yeast can also be used to convert sugar into proteins or sugar into lipids, into different kinds of molecules. And so yeast just basically rearrange carbon and other atoms into and reconfigure them to make different kinds of compounds. And so, and all of those instructions are encoded by DNA. And so what we do is we work with the yeast that naturally makes protein, that naturally converts sugar into protein, instead of using the yeast that converts it into alcohol or carbon dioxide or something else. But then what we do is that instead of having the yeast make any kind of protein, there are online databases that have all of the proteins known to man. And by what I mean by those proteins is that, for example, hemoglobin, right? For the different kinds of egg white proteins, different kinds of dairy proteins, different kinds of human proteins, they're all online. And when you get the DNA sequence that codes for each of those proteins, there are companies out there that have been around for decades that literally that synthesize that DNA and package it into like little tubes that then what we call plasmids, and those are already encoded for a specific protein. That protein that DNA sequence gets sprinkled into the yeast, and the yeast actually naturally, by poking little holes in their cell wall, you can integrate the DNA sequence into the yeast. And so as the yeast starts eating the sugar, instead of producing anything, it starts actually reading that DNA sequence as it metabolizes and starts producing that specific protein. And so that's not the innovation. That's every biotech company in the world. That's what biotechnology is. Every biotech company in the world uses that technology. What we specialize on is essentially designing and programming these yeast to not just become any kind of computer, but become supercomputers that can produce these proteins at very, very high levels that make them actually affordable for the food industry and for consumers, because insulin and these other medicines, they're thousands of dollars per kilogram. So you can make any protein, and you don't need very high yields to make them profitably. But for us, the key crux is, how do we actually democratize this technology?
So presumably then a key part of your kind of intellectual property and any of the companies that are in this space is that the microbe that you're working with and how you've programmed them to be those supercomputers? Would that be something that's quite unique between companies?
Exactly. And then you can essentially specialize, like make those yeast eat like such great computers for specific kinds of proteins, or for us, we've designed and made our microbe just really efficient at producing animal proteins very efficiently across the board.
Would another example that people may be aware of, and I'm not sure this is in market, but collagen's another protein, and I think I saw a company, Geltor. Are they using a similar type of kind of technology to do that?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, now there's quite a few companies all tackling different parts of the food system. Mm-hmm.
And just to kind of get our terminology right here, so microbial fermentation, as I understand it, is kind of like an umbrella, and then underneath that you have precision fermentation, which is what you're talking about, this use of DNA sequencing and inserting that into a microbe, and then it produces proteins out the other side. We haven't yet spoken about the what happens next, but I believe there's some sort of filtering that takes place versus, say, Paul Shapiro's company, Better Meat Co. That's also a type of microbial fermentation, but it's considered whole biomass fermentation. So how do we kind of separate these different types of fermentation?
Totally. So in the biomass fermentation, you actually eat the microbe. That is the product. So the yeast or the bacteria or the fungi, the fungus that you're using as like the bug to make the product. In biomass fermentation, the bug is the product. The microbe is the actual product that you eat. So like corn, QUORN, same thing. You're eating that fungus. For precision fermentation, the microbe is the little factory. So you're not actually eating it. It doesn't end up in the end product. It's just that little machine that converts that DNA sequence into a specific kind of protein. And so for us, the yeast that we work with, we don't sell. You can use it there are other uses for it, like fertilizer or other kinds of uses. But the actual product for us and for precision fermentation companies, is the specific molecule that the little supercomputer of the microbe made.
Got you. So that microbe in your instance produces this protein. You then separate them and you end up just selling the protein that's been produced. I think there are probably plenty of skeptics out there. We hear a whole lot of confusion and discussion about genetic modification.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you get this all the time. From what I'm hearing, there's genetic modification is used, genetic material, it is then separated and it's not in the kind of end product that someone consumes. But if someone's listening and thinking, this sounds a bit sus, what would you kind of like them to better understand about the process?
Well, I would say that there's like that's those are all fair questions and fair concerns. That's why for us, and again, it's a technology, right? You can use it for so many different purposes and so many different uses. We try, for us, the real question is, what are we doing to make the world a better place? And let's have that be our true north. And the reason why I say that is because you can actually make any protein on Earth, and even new kinds of proteins, and modify the proteins themselves to have different kinds of amino acid profiles, etc. We only produce proteins that are found in nature. So we do not engineer any of the proteins that we make. They are all the same ones. The same ones that the bodies already recognize as being bioavailable, as being nutritional, and that have a long history of being in our food system for centuries, oftentimes millennia. So I can't speak for other companies, but for us specifically, we only specialize in proteins that have been around in the food industry, in the food system, and in our bodies for centuries, if not millennia. and we don't change them.
If you put your egg white proteins under the microscope and you compared them to that from a live chicken egg, or from a live chicken that had an egg, would it look exactly the same?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the beauties of fermentation, which I love. So the egg white has, and the egg has hundreds of proteins, and they all do different things. And so when you eat an egg, you eat all the proteins at the same time, even some proteins that are actually not good for you. So for example, avidin is a protein in the egg white that actually binds to biotin if you don't denature it, i.e. cook it. And so sometimes it can create a biotin deficiency in the body, and that's why certain animals can't consume it, because it actually is not good for them. And so we can remove those proteins that are either like anti-nutrients, that actually are not totally beneficial, because as safe as these proteins are, because we know that they're safe broadly, but the challenge with these proteins is they weren't made for us. Like the chicken egg, right? The proteins in the egg were meant to support the life of a baby, of a chicken embryo, right? And to feed that. And so they just so happen to be also available to humans, and we can process them well, but they weren't necessarily intended for us. And so part of our job is, really deciphering which proteins are awesome and which ones maybe are not so awesome. And so we can actually pick and choose the different proteins and isolate them and use them as individual products. So all to say that the proteins, to answer your question directly, the proteins we produce are identical. So under microscope, they will have the same amino acid profile. They will be processed in the same way as traditional egg white proteins. But it depends. But the combination of them is not what we specialize in. We can combine them in different ways, and that's part of for applications for cakes. You don't necessarily want you want a protein that can foam really well, and so we can actually dial up some of the foaming properties to create lighter and fluffier kinds of cakes. And then for athletes, we can make scrambles that have actually a better amino acid profile than those of than a traditional chicken egg actually. And so that's how we can actually leverage the technology to create foods that are not just as good as what the animal makes, but how do we actually create food that is designed for the end user?
How far can this technology go with eggs? As I understand it, I think you have a product out already that is egg whites, but do you have plans, and you mentioned scramble there, but do you have plans to work towards recreating an entire egg? I'm sure people are thinking that right now. Is that possible to recreate that sort of entire experience, or do you see the consumer's kind of understanding and expectations of what an egg looks like changing?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, so our ambition is, and our plans are to replace the egg in all its forms, to create a animal-free, sustainable option for anyone who consumes eggs in whatever application. At the end of the day, for us, the number one thing is impact. And the way to drive impact is by meeting people where they're at. So we have other products like the Every protein that is actually an egg white protein that is found in the egg white, but actually has no eggy smell and no eggy taste. And so it's a very, very clean protein that you don't have to add any sugar or artificial sweeteners or chocolate, vanilla, or strawberry to consume a high protein drink, a high protein, your coffee in the mornings. How do you add protein to your diet in a way that doesn't come with all the other baggage and crap that's added to it? So there are some products where we're actually going well beyond what animals can do and what our existing food system can provide. But for the most part, on the egg side, our focus is meeting people where they're at and creating the same form factors, and then also eventually also kind of optimize and innovate and create new form factors. And I think ultimately for us, the focus is let's drive impact as much as possible. And what that means is firing across all cylinders, because the beauty of this technology is that it's very scalable. Like I mentioned with brewing and the way that brewers use yeast to convert sugar into alcohol, we actually can use very similar infrastructure. And so our factories at scale are like just big protein breweries. But instead of making beer, they're making protein. And, we have AB InBev as a partner, and they're the world's largest fermentation company that has a massive global footprint. And so we want to make protein, high quality protein, as available and accessible as Bud Light.
Mm-hmm. So I guess you're being careful not to overpromise, but you did say you want to replace egg in all its forms, and I'm just curious, with the scientists that you work with and the understanding of kind of what's possible.
Yeah.
Do you think there is a day where you walk into the grocery store and you pick up a carton of 12 eggs and they're produced without needing a chicken at all?
Yeah, 100%.
What is the biggest challenge with regards to scaling all of this? You mentioned before the efficiency of the microbes really important.
Yeah.
We haven't yet spoken about, I guess, the inputs and the amount of those and how much better it is than traditional animal agriculture. But I think that's interesting too. But what are the kind of biggest challenges to ramping this up, being able to provide it on a scale where it is having that significant impact that you're looking for?
Yeah, the biggest challenge to scale is, at this point, scale, like the capacity side. So having enough access to fermentation capacity very quickly, and that it's affordable. There is some fermentation capacity out there, but there really isn't a ton, and there's long lead times to build these kinds of facilities. So the biggest challenge to scale is just getting large enough capacities online as quickly as possible. The microbes, the beauty of this technology is that it's hard to imagine a chicken ever getting more efficient than it is today, right? We've sadly over-optimized that system where they're laying, almost an egg a day, when in the wild before we engineered them to produce at these kinds of levels, chickens in the wild normally produce between 1 to 2 dozen eggs a year. They're producing over 300 eggs per year today. That means that their bodies often register that as cancer because they're just producing chicken periods, right? That's what eggs are. So to the point where their oviducts actually have tumors around them. And so it's the same with like the chickens for that we use for meat, right? They have breasts so big that their legs break after like a couple of months of being on this earth, because we've bred them to be these monsters because they taste good. And so our approach and the beauty of our technology is that we can always optimize our microbes, and that's an ongoing process. There are companies out there that have been optimizing their microbes and their yeast for 30 years, and so it's really exciting that we continue getting better and better and better. And even once we beat the chicken, we can make our proteins even more affordable. So that way, every person on this earth, not just the people in LA and Melbourne and Sydney and San Francisco and New York, can get access to them, but really every human in the world, and to make global hunger a thing of the past. That should not, in a world this rich, food should be the last thing people should be worrying about.
I see often online people kind of questioning, how much better is this for the environment? And I read a paper that was published in Nature. It was just about a week or so ago on microbial protein. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it was more centered around what are the benefits of shifting. It looked at 20% of protein from ruminant animals to microbial protein. And so not relating to egg protein per se, but still an interesting paper. And their kind of modeling showed that just replacing 20% of the global ruminant meat on a per capita basis, it would pretty much halve the annual deforestation and related carbon emissions. And that's just one solution of many. I'm curious from your perspective, when it comes to eggs, how much better is what you're doing as a company and particularly on scale going to be for the environment compared to traditional chicken farming?
We're going through that process right now. So now that we're scaling, because we did some initial analyses when we were at lab scale, but it's just not representative of what I wanted. Real numbers that we can stand behind from our like larger scale operations, and that's what we're going through now. So in a few months we should have that data, but we should be better across almost every dimension than the animal and combat industry. The question is not if, it's by how much. And that's something that I want to highlight with a lot of folks, because this is something that I think from my days in government was very salient, which is we like to hold people to these impossible standards. And I remember when President Obama was running for re-election, people were like, "Oh, well, he didn't do enough, and he didn't do this, and he didn't do that, and like, and why, why didn't he do this? And he was supposed to be doing all these, he had all these, we had all these aspirations for this person, and so because he didn't get to all of those things, he shouldn't, he shouldn't be reelected." And one of the things that Joe Biden said is, "Don't compare him to the Almighty. Compare him to the alternative." And for me, that hits home because this is not the panacea. We need every solution on the table, and let's not start figuring, comparing and fighting against these little, which technology is better, which one is worse. At the end of the day, either we need every solution on the table, and whether it's having your own little chickens in your backyard, right? Like people are saying, well, what about animals? And like, what? It's right now the problem and the default, the de facto MO of this world is industrialized factory farms where we produce over 90% of the meat, milk, and eggs that we consume, and that is an ill of this world that needs to not exist for us to continue live, for us to have a shot at averting this climate catastrophe. And so my hope is that at the end of the day, these technologies, whether it's us or all of these other companies, as long as we are doing, that we are all fighting the good fight, and not every solution is going to be the best one for everyone. And that's the beauty of food, right? There's a billion brands when you go to a grocery store, and you as a consumer get to pick and choose what you want. No one's shoving it down your throat. If you want almond milk, great. If you want soy milk, great. As long as you're not drinking the factory farmed milk, you can drink from the 20 different options that are on that are at the grocery store. And I want the same thing to happen across every category, and that people have the choice to pick their winners and pick their cup of tea.
Talk to me about regulations. So I know that cultivated meat, it's been spoken about quite widely, Eat Just and their approval in Singapore for some level of distribution of their chicken product. Where does kind of precision fermentation sit within this conversation of being potentially considered a novel food, and does it need any form of government approval, or does it need to go through a process to be recognized as recognized as safe, or generally recognized as safe? What's that process look like?
So one is, yes, we need approval, and we go through all the traditional agencies for approval of our products. They're already processes in the U.S. In the U.S., we have the FDA GRAS process. In Australia, in Europe, there's the novel food process, etc. We follow all the existing pathways. And the beauty of it is that with the reason why you haven't really heard much about this technology in terms of approvals is because the process already exists. Like, the There's no
Mm-hmm.
new process to undergo because, again, the rennet for cheese making has already been approved. A lot of the vitamins that we eat today, a lot of these ingredients, the heme for impossible, like these, there's a lot of products that are already in our food system that came through this process, and so we use the same technology, more or less the same process, just different kinds of
Mm-hmm.
products that we apply it to, but we follow more or less the same process. That being said, on the regulatory and government side, well, you mentioned what are the challenges to scale besides the infrastructure piece, which I touched on. The other piece is we need this movement does not have any political capital. It has some financial capital,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's some great investors that have been backing this because they know that this is inevitable. The science is there, like the consumers want this, but there's zero political capital for this movement. Unlike clean energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? When the world was transitioning to clean energy, the government made a decision that we need energy independence. But we also need protein independence. We need food independence because we know that when pandemics strike, which are going to continue happening because 3 out of every 4 emerging infectious diseases, like COVID, right, SARS, MERS, swine flu, avian flu, they're all zoonotic. And so we know that pandemics, with having animals in factories that have no genetic diversity and that are pumped with antibiotics, to pumping healthy animals with antibiotics is a breeding ground for pandemics. And so we know that this is only going to intensify. COVID is just the beginning. And number two is we um, we this movement needs political capital, and in the clean energy space, the government knew that it didn't want to depend on other countries for its energy and
Mm-hmm.
food security, and that it became a national security issue. It wasn't because the government wanted to save the world and prevent climate change. It was, we don't want to rely on other countries for our energy supply. And the same thing, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
when famine hits, people go to the streets. And so food is a national security issue as well. And we need to be upfront, be very, very thoughtful about how can we support it. And I think that's one major obstacle to scale, is having political capital in the same way that the incumbent animal ag industry has.
Mm-hmm. If we double click on government funding for a moment here, given your background, I'm sure you've given a lot of thought into this, but if it was up to you, how would that funding be used to support this industry? And are there any policy changes that you would like to see that would better allow companies like yourself to scale and to prosper and to achieve the mission that you have?
Totally. I mean, number one, and this is a little bit of again, like, are you talking practically or hypothetically? If I had a magic wand, like, what would I do?
I think let's stick to practical. So in the current environment that exists, with your understanding of the policies that are in place, with your understanding of the funding or lack of funding, if there was greater political will, what would you like to see?
So, okay, I'll still say the hypothetical, which is, I mean, if we had enough political, which I think other countries can do, I just don't see it in the U.S. But it's not even a hard ask. It is just, look, let's level the playing field. Don't give us any money. Just remove the subsidies. Like, we have a subsidy regime in the U.S. against the worst foods for us. Like, there's a reason why the cheapest foods are the most terrible for us. It's not by accident. And so as long as we can remove the subsidies from and just put that money back into people's pockets, or do something, focus on reforestation or something else. But we don't even have to give money to companies like us or this movement. Just level the playing field so we can really compete like the free market, which is what we claim that we stand for. So that's like one kind of dream aspiration that I have
Yeah.
is just a level playing field. But in terms of the practicality of it, I think the most practical way that we can, if there's some political will, which I think is actually quite plausible, is whenever we're talking about competitiveness, which in the U.S. now is becoming a bigger and bigger conversation, is how do we stay on top, or how do we not keep falling behind? And so how do we stay competitive with new technologies, semiconductors, et cetera, lithium ion batteries? Like that's a conversation that's already happening. Let's include alternate proteins in there whenever these new industries are getting supported from government. Just add alternate proteins as part of that mandate. And so whatever funds are going towards lithium ion batteries, towards these other initiatives, also go towards alternate proteins. And that way, we can ensure that we as a country are staying on top of things, because China just announced in their 5-year agricultural plan, President Xi Jinping, alternative proteins as a core part of their future food strategy, in a way that in the U.S. that I don't know how many billions of dollars have gone into into traditional animal ag, but there was an amendment filed where there was $5 million allocated for alternative proteins, and that was like a huge moment for the space. And so you see that we've raised $200 million in private capital. $5 million from the U.S. government for the entire industry is it's symbolic more than anything, but it is really a drop in the ocean, and we need a lot more support if we're going to be competitive.
It's pleasing to see China doing that. I wonder if their government is under the same amount of pressure from lobbyists, and I guess that kind of extends to something else I wanted to ask you about, which was the egg industry and how you feel going forward, what that relationship will look like. Are they going to be heavily threatened and in opposition to what you're doing, or is it something that you think they will embrace and get involved with?
It's going to be it's a toss up, as we've seen with the existing players today, right? You have some of the biggest meat companies like JBS and Tyson and Cargill investing in these companies, not just as active participants, but investing and putting money behind cultivated and plant-based options, those two technologies. And so that already, we already see that with smart companies that are forward-looking. I see that very similarly with the egg industry. There are some egg companies that we're talking to that want to partner because they have distribution and they know that demand for animal protein is continuing to grow. And so we have to find a way that, it's hard to imagine that. The eggs and meat, they just can't scale the way that these technologies can. And so as we provide, for them, for a lot of companies, they're not wedded to the idea of torturing animals. They want to make money, right? They want to exist and want to give people what they want. And whether that's from chicken eggs or from fermentation eggs or plant-based eggs, they're pretty open. And I think when we talk to several companies, some of them actually have already launched their own plant-based eggs or launched their own plant-based options. Like Brazil's largest egg company launched a plant-based egg. And so there are a lot of really thoughtful companies that want to stay relevant because they know if they don't, they'll end up like Kodak, and they don't want to.
Speaking of plant-based eggs, and you mentioned, your story very much starts back with one of the founders of Hampton Creek, who you had a friendship with. I'm interested in, do you think going forward you'll see hybrid products? Say, for example, Eat Just, we've been talking about them, and I'm probably throwing you under the bus here or putting you on the spot, but feel free to comment or not comment. Do you feel like certain plant-based egg products can benefit by tapping into the precision fermented produced proteins like what you're producing? And is that something, are you planning to kind of work with those companies in a B2B capacity?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that's why we rebranded to Every, because we are not this like, we're not trying to be the next Beyond or Impossible or these consumer facing companies. At the end of the day, our focus is how do we enable everyone to win, right? All the world's biggest food
Mm,
companies and also all the challenger brands, the Just of the world, and all of these other plant-based companies that are doing awesome work and could really benefit from some proteins that they, in some ways it's not their specialty. They're great talking to consumers. They're great at building brands and getting distribution. What we want to do is power the future of food and being the intel of protein for these companies to
mm,
to really turbocharge their products so that when consumers eat them, they are delighted. Because if these products taste like crap or they don't function or they don't taste good, the space itself suffers, right? And so it's in our best
mhm,
interest and in my best interest to acknowledge that we can't do it alone, and that if we're going to prevent the world from heating up by another 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to partner and work with as many
mhm,
as many companies and people as possible. And I have no ego about that. I want to work with anyone and
mm,
everyone to get there as soon as possible.
mm. I love that. It's very much an ally approach within a competitive landscape. But you're right. You mentioned at the start there, having that joint mission that many of these companies has is a kind of thread that can kind of pull people together and
Mhm.
in some capacity be on the same page with
Yeah,
regards to
but
working towards a common goal.
totally. And that's what I love about this space more broadly. And, if I can go back and just reflect on my career a little bit, because I think it's important. I never thought that I could do well by doing good. Like it just
Mm,
was like that I could work in business and use capitalism as a force for good. That we can make money and grow professionally and and change the world while feeling good. Well, that grow professionally, make money while being able to change the world and do something that I felt good about. I thought either I joined a nonprofit or in government and did something that was good for the world, but I had to compromise on my paycheck, right, or my professional development,
mm,
or I worked for a company and sold my soul, right, made a ton of money, grew professionally, and went up the corporate ladder, but was selling my soul in the process. And I never thought that I could merge those worlds. And so I really feel like we operate almost like a nonprofit. And what I mean by that is
mm,
our bottom line is directly tied to the impact we have on this earth. For every kilo of protein that we sell, for every dollar of profit we make as a company, we can measure exactly, how many pounds of greenhouse gases are not being emitted into the atmosphere, how many gallons of water
mm,
we're saving, how many acres of land are not being deforested in Brazil, how many animals no longer have to live a life where they will never see the sun or they will never walk on grass. And I never thought that
mm.
that was possible in the private sector. And so I still feel, like I still feel like I'm in the government or nonprofit world in many respects because I'm having a positive impact, but I'm able to do it in a really fast paced environment where I can put matters in my own hands and make the change I want to see at very fast at a very very fast speed.
Yeah, that's got to be extremely powerful, an extremely powerful motivator to get you up out of bed every morning. I know that your company has grown rapidly. I'm not sure how many staff you have now, but I did want to get your thoughts towards the end of this conversation about the pressure that inevitably comes with taking on a mission like this, building a team, taking on investment from
Yeah.
companies that expect you to perform well, um, dealing with staff, increasing numbers of staff, people, their emotions, trying to build culture. And I thought that you might have a few tips for other young leaders out there that also have that ambition to scale their company like yours.
I think one thing that's been very helpful is celebrating myself. Um, and what I mean by that is for such a long, for a very long time, I was my own worst critic. and I just beat the hell out of myself. And that's how I pushed myself to achieve. And I thought that by being so critical of myself that's how I would achieve. And it engendered a lot of unhappiness and stress in my life. And I began working with my therapist and just, and focusing more on like, just being grateful, like how lucky I am that I know what my purpose is on this earth, that I know that I was put on this earth and I feel it to my core that I'm here to shut down the last factory farm on earth. That that I want to be on my deathbed. And if I would have accomplished that, I know that I lived a life that I would be very, very proud of. And that gives me a lot of comfort, and that my family supports me, that they're alive, that I get to work with really great people, and also kind of focus on the day to day. Like sometimes, I think when I take a step back, it can be scary and maybe, there's a lot of pressure, but in the day to day, it gets lost. And that in some ways is healthy as well for me, because I'm just focused on one foot in front of the other, one day at a time, one meeting at a time. And, yes, we raised a lot of money. We've grown the company a lot, but I've also been doing this now for 8 years. And I was 22. When I started the company, I had no idea what I was doing. So in some ways, the pressure was on then. And actually, the more money we raise, the bigger the company gets. It also actually feels a lot easier, the easier it gets too, counterintuitively, because I feel like I know what I'm doing. I have people around me that I really trust. Like technology works, like there's a lot of risk that we've retired and taken off the table. And so that gives me actually a lot more comfort to lean into that power. And so I think with a lot of you mentioned a lot of founders or people who are looking at their careers, I am very happy that I just went for it. And I thank myself as often as I remember that I just go for it. And, in some ways, like the universe finds a way to take care of yourself if I'm pursuing, my true north, and my soul's path, and having that kind of clarity and just throwing myself out there and asking for help has made all the difference.
If someone is listening and is really excited by what you're talking about and just thinks this is a really interesting category, and perhaps they're wanting to get involved somehow in terms of their career, would you recommend that they attend any events or connect with any sort of industry bodies? Where would be the kind of best place for them to get started with regards to learning a little bit more?
Yeah, definitely look at gfi.org. They're an awesome nonprofit that has a ton of materials to learn about the space. But two is also just like, I think one thing that I've loved that I really appreciate about myself is trying to get, like, forcing myself to get out of my head and into just inaction and just trying it out. And that's what I loved about the internships. I was like, I want to work in government. So then I went ahead and did an internship. And then I was like, I hate this. This is not where I want to be. Try another internship. And I didn't like that. And I tried again. And it was really possible of elimination. But the more times that I said no, like, I don't think had I not done all of those internships right when I did and just went for it, I would likely have gone into government very definitively, because I would not have had those data points. And so all to say that if people are intrigued and interested and you're working now in some other company, apply to these companies. Like, we're hiring across the board. And this movement needs people who have every kind of skill set under the sun, whether it's finance or operations or, social media. Like, now these companies are big enough and the space is big enough that before, we only needed scientists, right, to build the technology. Now these companies are big. Now we're big enough that we're hiring, across the board for product managers, and marketing managers and social media and league, councils and all these other positions that, I would say, why not, I learned so much through the interview process, and I hope that for some of you that may be inspired to
Mhm.
look at some of these job ads and apply. And you may be surprised. You have, I'm sure, the fire plus the fire in the belly and the hunger to make stuff happen is something that I cannot underscore enough when it comes to when I interview candidates. Like, they need to really
Mhm.
want it, and that's something that you just can't teach.
Arturo, this has been great. I've really enjoyed this. I might get you to leave us with a bit more of your vision. In 10 years from now, you already have some products in the market. We've spoken about those. But in 10 years from now, where would you like to see the Every company, and what would success look like for you at that time?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that, because we have an 8-year target and then an 18-year target as a company. So we have and we have obviously our annual goals. But in 8 years, so in 2030, our
Mm-hmm.
our objective is to become the world's largest supplier of egg protein. And that's not like vegan egg company. I think we're probably almost there. But the world's largest supplier of egg protein on Earth. And then by 2040 is to enable the shutdown of the last factory farm on Earth. And that is our goal as a company. And what that means is, in the short term, really work, to what we talked about earlier, really owning and making the egg accessible across every kind of application in the forms that consumers know them, whether it's in cakes or cookies or scrambles or pasta, or frittatas or protein powders. And then in parallel is work to actually support all the other companies in the space to produce every kind of animal protein that companies are already using today to make that future possible through all of our partners.
One thing that we didn't touch on, but if someone's in the States and they're thinking, "Oh, I'd like to buy a product that's using their egg protein," Are there any brands that you can, or products that you can speak to that are using it?
Yeah. So we launched. We're pretty tight on product right now, but we will. But we launched with Pressed Juicery in the U.S., in New York and L.A. It's like we launched the world's first protein smoothie made with animal-free animal protein with them last year, and we may do something later on, but that was a limited time offering. And now we are working with Chantal Guillaume, which is an awesome, one of the best French macaron companies on the West Coast that makes French macarons, which is like the holy grail of egg white functionality. We used our Every Egg White, which is where we launched it, and they're in the Bay Area, so you can get them in the stores or online anywhere in the U.S. through them. We just sold out, but we will be restocking soon, so people can now eat our product if they're in the U.S. wherever they are.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing and all of your incredible insights. It's been very, very interesting. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I look forward to watching how your story and the story of the Every company unfolds in the coming years. I'll, of course, put a link to your personal socials and company website, etc., in the show notes. I highly recommend that anyone who's been listening, please connect with Arturo online and stay up to date with everything that he's doing. Thank you so much, Arturo, and please do enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, Simon, thank you so much for having me. This was such a treat. I'm so glad to have been a part of it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information covered interesting and instructive. If you did and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Yes, the full-length videos. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a review on Apple or Spotify. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests you'd like to see on the show, or questions that you'd like to have answered, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take note of these comments when planning future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.